Rockies never seem rockier for a New York accountant who moves his family to Colorado to take on a rundown hotel. Welcome everyone, I'm Dale and this is Cinema Historia. This week we're going back to 1972 for a screwball comedy called Snowball Express, starring Dean Jones, Nancy Olson, Harry Morgan, and Keenan Wynn. And this is directed by Norman Tokar. So where does our story begin this week? Well, yes, it begins with a New York accountant by the name of Johnny Baxter. And Johnny Baxter is played by Dean Jones. So he's at his corporate job when a probate attorney tells him that his recently deceased uncle, Jacob Barnsworth, has left him sole ownership of the Grand Imperial Hotel in Silver Hill, Colorado, which is a fictional town, by the way. Barnsworth claims that the hotel brings in more than $14,000 a month. So he moves his family of wife and 2 kids to take proprietorship of the hotel. But when he gets there, it's an immensely run-down building with no heat, and there's an old lodger by the name of Jesse McCord, played by Harry Morgan, living in the shed. So Baxter assigns him the job as a bellhop. Now, one of the locals explains that the Grand Imperial sits on a huge amount of property. So Baxter realizes that he can turn the hotel into a ski resort, but he needs a loan. So he attempts to secure funds for his plans. He goes to the local bank, and the local banker, Martin Ridgway, played by Keenan Wynn, expresses his interest in Baxter's idea, but he'd like to buy the lodge for himself. So he declines Baxter his loan. So, what happens next? Well, there's a bunch of events that actually factor in. Does he eventually get his loan? We're not sure. Does Wally setting dynamite to a tree stump causing an avalanche for a passing train, does that help? Or maybe an annual snowmobile race that's worth $2,500 for big prize money? A lot of these things factor in and more that make it into a really neat screwball comedy. It wasn't just a lot of these events that happen. A lot of the actors played a big part in this. Dean Jones, if you remember, he played in The Love Bug in 1968, just a few years earlier. And in 1995, he was inducted as a Disney Legends for his film work. Now, Nancy Olson, who plays his wife, she was also in another Disney film in 1961 alongside Fred MacMurray in The Absent-Minded Professor. Harry Morgan, he appeared in over 100 films, including other Disney films, but you probably remember him from the TV series MASH. From 1975 to 1983, he played Colonel Sherman T. Potter. And Keenan Wynn, he was a big star in the 60s. You may not recognize his face, but you probably heard his voice recently if you watched the 1970 TV movie Santa Claus is Coming to Town. He plays the voice of the Winter Warlock. And this week's trivia question goes to Norman Tokar, the director. So our trivia question: in the early 1960s, was Norman Tokar working with certain type of actors that encouraged Disney to hire him? Was Norman working with certain type of actors that encouraged Disney to hire him? So, a little more history and the answer to our trivia question coming up next. Now, since our movie has a snowmobile race in it, I thought it might be interesting to talk about snowmobiling. And the helmet you're seeing behind me is actually one of my old helmets from the 1980s. It was originally a Ski-Doo helmet. I peeled the decals off to turn it into a Polaris helmet, and then in the end it became a Yamaha helmet. I'd love to hear if you were an avid snowmobiler. Leave it in the comments with what brand you used to own or still own. It'd be nice to hear. But to go to the history, in 1958, Joseph Bombardier created an economical, small, single-tracked vehicle with a front-mounted engine that could easily glide over snow. The snowmobile was an inexpensive way to access this new frontier, and snowmobile sales skyrocketed. Just 13 years after the sale of the first Ski-Doo, there were over 100 snowmobile manufacturers, and sales climbed to a staggering 495,000 snowmobiles sold in 1971. And there were 1.5 million cruising the woods and frozen lakes of the north. Snowmobiling was on the national news as America's hottest new trend. Even when sales dipped slightly to 460,000 units in 1972, there were still over 2 million registered snowmobiles on the trails. Now in 1973, we saw noise restrictions, regulations, which I kind of understand. When we were out on a Saturday night, people were trying to watch the hockey night in Canada off their antenna, and it would just totally screw up their TV reception. But the noise regulations, coupled with the first oil embargo, resulted in some manufacturers closing up shop. Sales dropped to 450,000 units that year, but the industry still seemed exceptionally strong. By 1974, though, gas prices increased by 300%, and the stock market crash caused the sales to drop to 435,000 units. Now, with the emergence of two new recreational vehicles, the jet ski and the new three-wheeler ATVs, now consumers had more choices. A few lean years of snow and a second oil embargo in 1979 caused sales to drop to 200,000 units. Mainstays like Snowjet, Rupp, and Scorpion were suddenly gone. And I think we had a Rupp actually when we were kids, kind of a neat snowmobile. Other manufacturers that had other businesses like Johnson, Evinrude, Mercury, Kawasaki, and John Deere got out of the snowmobile market. By the mid-80s, though, there were still over 4 million snowmobiles being used, a peak we may never see again. The remaining manufacturers began making higher quality machines that could take advantage of what was now a well-established trail system. A lot of fun. There was a lot of fun back then. And the answer to our trivia question. The director Norman Cotard in the early 60s was Norman Cotard, working with certain type of actors that encouraged Walt Disney to hire him. He certainly was, if you figured this one out. He worked with juvenile actors on 93 episodes of the TV sitcom Leave It to Beaver. It encouraged Walt Disney to hire him to direct family features as he frequently used children in key roles. He went on to direct several Disney films, including his most commercially successful film, the comedy western, The Apple Dumpling Gang, in 1975. And I went as a young guy to see this movie with our family back then. It was kind of neat. Got a lot of fun. Tim Conway, Don Knotts, and a Canadian actress, Susan Clark, was in that movie. I'd like to thank my new subscribers. Thanks for supporting my channel. It's a big help to help me keep going. It's a lot of fun doing this. Talking about snowmobiling, we were snowmobiling for about 20 years. It was a lot of fun. And this movie is a lot of fun. If you want something that's kind of a cross between the Love Bug and the Money Pit, I highly recommend this one. Or if you're just into skiing and you want to see how the pros do it. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope to see you back next week.
Excuse me, where do I catch the ski lift on the slope? Oh!